Hello, this is Matt Janucki, and you're listening to Inside Men's Mental Health, brought to you by Psych Sessions. Here we explore this thing called masculinity and its impact on men's mental health, relationships, and communities. We'll learn together through conversations with thought leaders, innovators, and industry experts. Our conversations will also help us understand how these experts became interested in men's mental health and the ways their journeys have made them who they are today. In this episode, I talk with Dr. Ronald Levant, Professor Emeritus with the University of Akron, and former president of both the American Psychological Association and the American Psychological Association's Division 51. This was a real pleasure to have a conversation with one of the giants in the field of men's mental health. It was fascinating to learn about Ron's precarious journey to higher education, as well as some of his major contributions to the field, such as his work on normative male alexithymia, traditional masculinity, and fatherhood. A quick note: the audio quality is a bit problematic in this episode. My voice is a bit loud, but Ron's is pretty good. My apologies. Thanks for listening and enjoy. Well, today, I'd just like to welcome Dr. Ron Levant. Dr. Levant, just would like to talk a little bit about your background here, give people a little bit of a snapshot of your background. So with this, you can relax for just a minute while I talk about some of your experiences here, but I think these will just give people a little bit of an idea of just the diversity of your work and also just your expertise in this space as well. So, Ron, you're Professor Emeritus in the Department of Psychology with the University of Akron. You're past president of the American Psychological Association. You're past president, indeed, I think that you were the first president of APA Division 51, now called the Society for the Psychology of Men and Masculinities. I know that name has changed a little bit. I think it was the Society for the Psychological Study of Men and Masculinity. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. You are past editor and remain a senior editorial board member for the American Psychological Association's journal, The Psychology of Men and Masculinities, which really is the premier academic journal that highlights just ideas and research on men and masculinities. You've written or edited a number of books focused on men, masculinities, men's mental health, including A New Psychology of Men and A New Psychotherapy for Men with William Pollack. And I know that maybe these books are getting to be like oldies in this area, but I think they're important to mention. I'd say oldies but goodies. Those books, as a graduate student in the 2000s, these books were, groundbreaking, informative, and I think still are. So I want to make sure to mention them, and we'll revisit them a bit later. Written The Psychology of Men and Masculinities, or edited that with Joel Wong. Co-written The Tough Standard, The Hard Truths About Masculinity and Violence. And then one of your books that will be coming out soon, or it's in process, is Assessing and Treating Emotionally Inexpressive Men. But that's not it, right? So you've also done other work. You've done training videos. So you've done work to try and help people understand or learn ways to engage men in psychotherapy. So in the kind of the video space, and you're in some of those videos too. And so I'm thinking of the video where you work with Raymond. I've shown that video to my students, or some of those pieces of those videos. And so you've been in that area. You've also been engaged in media more broadly. And so you've engaged with outlets like the New York Times and the Washington Post to engage in conversations around just various aspects of men's mental health and wellness. And finally, you're a researcher. You're a researcher who's contributed substantially to our knowledge of what masculinities look like and how they impact men. So just really grateful for the opportunity to talk to you today, Ron.
Thank you, Matt.
Yeah,
Appreciate
you're
it.
welcome. So one piece that I'd like to just get us started with that I'm really curious about is, for somebody who's had such an impact on the field, how did this start for you? When or how did you become interested in this work around men, masculinities, etc.?
Okay. Well, let's see, a little bit of background. I did my doctoral work at Harvard in a radical program called Clinical Psychology in Public Practice. It
Okay.
was born out of the late 60s, and it was a unique program in which one of the criteria for admission is that you had to have been a campus activist
Okay.
undergrad, and I was, and I actually went to medical school before I went to grad
Hmm.
school. I left medical school, but while there, I formed an SDS, Students for Democratic Society affiliate
Okay. Okay.
at a medical school campus. So um, anyway, it was a unique program. Um, and while I was there, I grew more and more interested in family therapy. And there was nobody on the faculty that could teach it. When I did my internship at Cambridge Guidance Center, we had a revolt. And back in the 60s and 70s, we were always revolting. That was kind of our modus
Yeah. Yeah.
operandi.
Sure.
So we had a revolt and we forced the administration to hire a trainer from Eastern Pennsylvania Psychiatric Institute to come up once a month and
Hmm.
do trainings in family therapy. And so I pursued that, kind of worked more in the, I don't know if you're familiar with the Bowen method. And um, and it started a research program focused on parenting.
Okay.
It's my first job at Boston University. Um, and so I had my doctor, the way I organized my lab is I had my doctoral students do kind of coordinated dissertations so that we could kind of tackle a larger problem. Um, Now, at the same time that I was doing this, doing research on parenting, I was a divorced semi-custodial father of a tween-age daughter,
Okay.
and I wasn't doing very well as a father. And divorce, as you probably are aware, has enormous negative effects on the children, and that was the case in my family. But here I was, I was on the faculty. It was 1979, and a movie, Kramer versus Kramer, came out. This was a movie starring Dustin Hoffman and Meryl Streep, who portrayed a divorcing couple. In 1979, divorce was starting to explode. This is the beginning of what was called the divorce revolution.
Yeah.
Um, and I, after watching that movie, I had kind of a slow-moving epiphany. In other words, epiphany is usually right at once, but mine was slower. It took weeks because
Okay.
I'm a little bit dumber. And but anyway, I finally got to the idea that maybe it wasn't that I just was such an inadequate father, but that men of my generation, and I'm a baby boomer, were really not prepared for kind of a hands-on parenting role. Um, and like my dad, uh, the only time he interacted with me and my brother was when he was supervising our work,
Mm-hmm.
or when we had done something bad and we deserved
Yeah.
punishment.
Yeah.
And here I was, my daughter living with me for the entire summer. I wasn't in a relationship, so I couldn't push it off onto my girlfriend. I had to
Yeah.
deal
Yeah.
with her myself, and I didn't do a very good job. Um, and at that time, one of my grad students and I were running buddies. We were training for the Boston Marathon. So we would be out on 10, 15-mile runs, a lot of time to talk. So we started talking about, well, what would it take to prepare men to be more engaged
Yeah.
fathers? And
Yeah.
we developed the idea for a parent education course for fathers. And I know your audience can't see this, but yeah, so we developed, a leader's
Yeah.
guide and a father's workbook. And then Greg used this for his dissertation,
Okay.
where he did a quasi-experimental design of basically working with a group of fathers, um, while another group served as kind of a control group, and then they got the training. So it was a kind of delayed treatment control group. And so he did his dissertation, and it came out very interesting that it was an 8 or 10 week, I forget now, intervention
Okay.
um, produced fairly significant changes in the family because we assessed not only the father, we used a fairly complicated measure that involved videotaping his interactions with his children. And we also took assessments from the wife and from one of his children. And it had significant effects. I mean, it was changing the family. The dad became more central.
Hmm.
The wife and the child perceived it, and the dad felt better about it. And so, this was pretty good for a dissertation.
Yeah, absolutely.
We published, I think, an article based on the dissertation, but that wasn't the main thing. The main thing was at that time, BU was looking for a way to repair its relationship with the community. It had been gobbling up land to expand and in the surrounding community, and people were kind of unhappy with BU. So my dean asked me if I wanted to essentially get course relief to run a program for about 5 years. And it was called the BU Fatherhood Project. And
Yeah.
So it was offered to the community as a non-college credit course, kind of an enrichment activity, if you
Yeah.
will.
Okay.
And it was very successful. We got tons of publicity. We first got a big article in the Christian Science Monitor because this was happening like in '83, I think is when we started.
Okay.
And you were just starting to see men, more engaged with kids. This was in Boston, obviously. And so you could see dads in Harvard Square pushing strollers or carrying infants in chest packs. And it was just starting to happen, and we were right on the edge. And so we became very hot. And so the Christian Science Monitor did a story. I was on 2020 with Barbara Walters,
Okay.
on Oprah Winfrey. Later on, I got a big spread in People magazine. So it kind of gave me like a little bit of celebrity at the very beginning,
Yeah, absolutely. At the beginning of your career.
very beginning of my career. Now, another thing that happened that kind of feeds into this, in 1980, I did a summer research fellowship with Joe Pleck at the Wellesley Center for Research on Women. Joe and I both have doctorates in clinical psych from Harvard, but from different programs.
Okay.
Because Harvard has a habit of killing its clinical psych programs about every 4 or 5 years. So there are these orphan programs hanging around. So Joe was in the one that got killed before mine was started. Mine
Got
was
it.
called Clinical Psychology and Public Practice. And it was in the ed school, and his was in psych and social relations. And we didn't know each other as grad students, but met in 1980 when I did the summer fellowship with him. And he was at that time reviewing galleys for his landmark book, The Myth of Masculinity. And he asked me to proof a galley of one of his chapters, So that's how I kind of learned a little bit about this new thinking, the gender role strain paradigm. Now, something happened in the fatherhood course that really started me in this direction.
Okay.
This was an incident that happened with one father. So the way the courses, just explain how they worked, is back in the early 80s, video equipment was the coolest thing you could have. And I had a big grant, so I bought more video equipment than any sane person would ever want. I had 3 complete setups of basically a tripod with a camera, microphone coming down from the ceiling, an AV cart with a video deck, and a special effects generator.
Okay.
And so when the men came into our room, they were awed by the equipment. It's like, you guys really got it going on, you know? And we told them we'd teach them how to be a better dad, the same way they might have learned how to improve their tennis
Mm.
serve or golf
Yeah.
swing. We'd videotape it, we'd break it down, analyze it, figure out how to do it better. So that was the pitch, and it really worked. So um, one day I noticed that one of the dads was out of sorts. And so not knowing much about men and emotions, I said, well, I said, what's happening? He says, my son stood me up for a father-son hockey game. The guy was a divorced dad, and this was
Okay.
an important event for him. And again, not knowing much about men and emotions at that time, I said, well, how did you feel about that? I never asked that question again.
Right, right.
And he looked at me blankly. And I said, okay, let's role play this. Oh no, what he said was, he didn't look at me. He said he shouldn't have done it.
Yeah, yeah.
That's what he said. I said, okay, but how did you feel?
Feel.
And that's when
Hmm.
he looked at me blankly. So I said, well, let's role play this. So you play yourself, another dad, you play his ex-wife, as she delivers the news to him that his son had forgotten about the game. Do the video, play it back. His shoulders, when he gets the news, his shoulders fall into a slump, his face
Mm.
goes into a frown. We're showing him the tape. We're actually stopping the tape so he can see it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, because the special effects generator could do it in slow-mo and kind of show him. And so I said, so look at the video, look at yourself in the monitor. How did you feel? He's going like this.
Mm.
I guess I must have felt disappointed. And I thought, I guess I must have felt disappointed with this much coaching.
Yeah, yeah.
So I thought, that seems unusual. How might a mother react in a similar circumstance, like her daughter standing her up for a shopping date? And in my own mind, I'm doing this,
Yeah.
not talking to anybody. And I imagined her saying, well, at first I was surprised. It's not like her to act that way. Then I was angry that she acted with so little regard for my feelings. Then I was worried that maybe she was upset with me and this is her way of expressing it. And then I was disappointed and annoyed because I built my whole day around this and now it was ruined.
Yeah.
So again, I guess I must have been disappointed too. I was surprised. I was angry. I was worried. I was disappointed. I was annoyed. I went back to my colleagues and I said, what do you make of this? They were no help. They said, Ron, women are just more emotional by nature.
Mm. Okay.
I said, I don't think so.
Yeah.
I don't think so. Um, and so when I was a grad student, I had the option to concentrate in child clinical. There were different tracks you
Okay.
could do. And so I had to know more developmental psych than my classmates. So I knew there was an area in developmental psych that was called emotion socialization.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So what I did is I went back to the literature, and some of this literature had just come out like in 81, and this was like 83. Some went back to the 70s. And what I found was very, very interesting. I found that as neonates, males are more emotionally expressive than girls. Boys are more emotionally expressive than girls. But neonates don't do much. They cry and they sleep,
Yeah.
basically. But then this study was also had the same findings. And the way they did these studies, Matt, is they would set up video cameras in people's homes and they would videotape hours and hours of interaction. Then they would code the videos.
Right.
And you can't get funding for a study like this today. And they found at 6 months and 1 year of age, when obviously babies do a lot more than cry and
Yeah.
sleep, who they coo and giggle and make gestural signals toward the mother, and the same finding:
Yeah.
boys were more emotionally expressive than girls. By 2 years of age, one study found that girls were showing greater verbal expressivity, by which they meant using more emotion words in their conversation. And then between 4 and 6, this ingenious experiment showed that boys lose their facial expressivity. I'll tell you a little bit about the study. They brought a mother with a child, either a boy or a girl, into the lab between the age of 4 and 6. They showed the child emotionally stimulating slides,
Okay.
videotaped the child's face. The mother was in an adjacent room watching her child on the monitor, and her job was to guess the slide shown to her child. At 4 years of age, mothers were equally accurate with sons and daughters.
Okay.
But as the children aged, mothers grew less accurate with their sons, so that by the age of 6, there were significant differences
Okay.
between mothers of sons and mothers of daughters. So you have to say, well, what's happening to boys between 4 and 6? Well, they're in preschool and school, and every boy knows that the worst thing you could do is walk, talk, act, or throw like a girl.
Yeah.
So boys are avoiding anything that looks feminine, and that includes the expression of emotions.
Yeah.
So with that, I wrote an article or a book chapter, forget exactly what it was. I think it was a journal article in 1992. It's published in 1992. Describing my theory of I called it the normative male alexithymia hypothesis. Now, alexithymia, you may know, but maybe your audience
Yeah, I
doesn't.
think it would be helpful if you could unpack that a little bit. I think a lot of folks may be unsure what that means. So yeah, tell us a little bit about that, Ron.
Yeah, so alexithymia literally means without words for emotions. And it's a clinical construct. It's not, a diagnosis. You won't find it in DSM,
Yeah.
but it's thought to go along with certain disorders. And it was initially studied in the context of psychosomatic disorders in the late 60s, early 70s, and in a sense kind of been found in trauma, eating disorders, and substance use disorders. And scales were developed. The most prominent one is called the Toronto Alexithymia Scale 20. Been used in probably thousands of
Yeah.
studies. Actually developed clinically based cutoffs for where a scale score kind of defines a patient as being alexithymic. So my theory was that if in this point in time, I was also kind of thinking about masculinity norms, and I was about to develop the male role norms inventory, but I hadn't gotten there. I was mostly focused on Brannon's scale, the Brannon masculinity scale, which was a great idea, but he never was able to accomplish even an exploratory factor analysis. And in fact, he wrote in one of his chapters saying that factor analysis is a poor tool for
Okay.
scale development. We look back and laugh because it's obviously the tool
It's the
for
standard. Yeah, right. Yeah.
multidimensional scales,
Right.
right? So I theorize that boys who are reared to conform to the masculinity norm of restricting the expression of emotions, which as a norm occurs in the 3 most prominent masculinity scales, the male role norms inventory, the conformity to masculine norms inventory, and the gender role conflict scale, all have,
Yeah.
they don't call it, 2 of them call it restrictive emotionality, and the CMNI calls it emotional control. So I said that if you're raising your boys and they're being policed by their peers to conform to masculine norms, and one of them is to not express emotions, well, they're at greater risk to grow up to be adults who are alexithymic. Then I got attacked
Okay.
from some of the people in our own division, and Uh, and so what I next did is I said, well, let's see if I can make a case for it. I did a narrative literature review of sex differences in alexithymia, and then I did a meta-analysis. And in both cases showed that with non-clinical samples, that is mostly college students, uh, men have higher scores than women, but the effect size is small, as are the effect sizes for most psychological sex differences. You know, Janet Hyde's
Yeah.
mega analysis, or whatever she called it, of 46 meta-analysis showed that 78% of all sex differences in psychological traits are trivial or small. So
Yeah.
ours was beyond what's called the recommended minimum, which is 0.2 of an effect size. It was 0.22, but it was small, but it was there.
Yeah.
So then I said, well, we need something to assess this, and the task 20 is really has things in it that don't really apply, like externally oriented thinking and pensée arbitraire and different aspects of alexithymia. So I developed the normative male alexithymia scale, um, and I started working on a treatment program that I called alexithymia reduction treatment. I had my career had sort of involved moves. I had moved from Boston University to Rutgers.
Mhm.
So I didn't actually physically move because it was the recession and we couldn't sell our house.
Yeah.
So I commuted from Boston to New Jersey for a couple of years.
Okay.
I was brought in as the chair apparent because the chair was going to retire of the counseling psychology program. At BU, I was also in a counseling psychology program. And then the dean reneged on adding faculty lines. So I resigned, went back to Boston. Well, I hadn't left Boston, but I got an appointment at Harvard Medical School. And I had a day a week practice when I was at Rutgers because I would leave Rutgers Thursday evening and I had a Friday practice that was allowed, that was encouraged
Okay.
because they wanted faculty to have their clinical skills sharp to train students. So I expanded it to a 5-day a week practice. I told my colleagues at Harvard Medical School, send me the men that your women clients complain about. And
Okay.
and I got a practice full of men, a lot of whom were alexithymic. So
Mm.
I started
Yeah.
experimenting with techniques. And the video you saw was of one of those clients. It was actually the video because of legal issues with the video company and not wanting to use the actual client. It was an actor, but it was based on a script based on the
Yeah.
therapy of the actual client. And I thought it was pretty faithful to the
Yeah.
actual client. So I started, developing these, this intervention. A manual it's manualized. It can be used with any approach to psychotherapy. It doesn't take it. It's like 6 sessions, but it doesn't take the whole session. It has
Okay.
homework exercises, and you can kind of integrate it if you're doing psychodynamic or cognitive behavior or whatever. It can go in. And around that time, I when I was at Rutgers, I developed the first version of the male role norms inventory, and so I was kind of moving in the direction of psychology of men. Bill Pollock and I were both, in Massachusetts at the time. We knew each other. I think I invited him to. I was the chair of the board of professional affairs of the Massachusetts Psych Association. I invited him
Okay.
as a member. We got to know each other that way, and we together edited A New Psychology of Men, which was an enormous success. It stayed in print for 20 years, and it was a standard graduate text and reference
Yeah.
book, Psychology of Men and Masculinity, for that time. Um, and it helped define the field. It helped
Yeah.
define the field.
Yeah. I want to ask you about that. If I mean, just first a reflection as you talked about this trajectory up to this point, Ron, of this somebody, one of your colleagues saying like, well, women are just more emotional than men, right? And then your journey to test that out and then explore that further and you know develop this way to kind of describe the emotional lives of many men. And so I really I really just like that, like how these, I think these small moments sometimes that I think can set off interesting journeys in our research journeys. I, Also what I want to ask you about is that new psychology of men. I think I hear new psychology of men that's in contrast to like an older or a different psychology of men. And maybe you could just talk a little bit about what that means, like the new psychology of men in contrast to what other psychology of men.
Sure. When I first started talking about a new psychology, man, before we even had a book out, my skeptical colleagues would say, a new psychology of men? Ron, all psychology is a psychology of men.
Mm, hmm.
And that was true because if you look at, these iconic longitudinal studies
Yeah.
that studied human beings from 5 years old to their 50s, like Bruner and Kagan and
Yeah.
all those
Yeah.
people, they were all males.
Men. Yeah.
There were no women in there. And they were absolutely right. But all of those studies took gender as a given, as basically the same thing as sex,
Hmm.
and didn't understand gender the way I was starting to understand it, which was, I don't think, so they thought of basically as, masculinity, femininity as kind of inborn personality traits that
Yeah.
go with your, your chromosomes.
Yeah. Right.
You have a Y chromosome, you're masculine. If you have two X's, you're feminine. And that was what we called gender essentialism. That essentially saying that basically your biology determines your personality.
Right.
And Brannon, on the other hand, put forward the idea that these are norms, these are social norms, and he had four of them. Uh, the sturdy oak, I forget all four of them. We can
Right.
look them up, but um, uh, so he has to be credited with kind of saying that no, these are not givens with the Y chromosome. These are social norms, and that means that children learn them through though he didn't go this far, we went this far, through the process of social learning, which
Yeah.
includes modeling, reinforcement, and punishment. The whole social learning theory paradigm comes into play here. And Dollard Miller and that whole notion about social learning. Um, so, so these studies that, were indeed of men did not kind of take a critical perspective on masculinity. In fact, they regarded adopting the stereotypical traits of your biological sex as essential to mental health. And I'll give you a vivid example of
Yeah,
that.
that'd be great.
In the in the 50s and even into the 60s, one of the main reasons for referring a boy to a child guidance clinic was not ADHD, which it is today,
Right.
but it would be effeminate behavior.
Mm, yeah.
I had a video that I used to show when I taught group counseling for children, and it was activity group therapy, and it had 14 boys in there, and it was like a wood shop, and the therapist would walk around and they do kind of ex-Linnean sort of reflection of feelings through the activities. And Uh, of the 14 boys, 11 had been referred for effeminate behavior.
Hmm. That's that's really, I think, striking to hear you mention that. I think probably, most of us, younger in the field don't maybe have a grasp of that. So I think to hear you say that is really, yeah, just striking.
Yeah, no, it is striking, and how much things it's
Have
striking
changed.
because of how much things have changed.
Yeah,
But that's so I would say yes, indeed, you're right. But that was research that didn't really understand masculinity the way we do,
yeah,
which is as a set of social norms that are embedded in a given culture, a given historical era, that they change over time. I would give examples like, look, Jim O'Neill has one norm, restrictive affectionate behavior between men in the gender role conflict scale.
right.
Well, in the mid 1800s, the opposite was the norm. Men were verbally and physically affectionate to each other, including kissing. And when
Mm,
they traveled, they slept because back then it was hard to travel by train or
sure.
whatever. They would sleep in the same bed.
Wow.
Can't
Yeah,
imagine that these
yeah,
days, right?
right.
So obviously I also pull out pictures of FDR as a little boy, and he was
Yeah,
dressed in frilly dresses. You can Google this,
yeah,
frilly dresses, and he had long tresses, long curls, and all that. Obviously, the standards for masculinity. Rotundo has written a book. He's an historian. It's called The History of American Manhood. And he shows, basically how these have changed within one country.
yeah.
But then when you expand the scope and look more broadly, you go to Gilmore's Manhood in the Making, where he surveys a bunch of different cultures ranging from the Neolithic to modern. You can see that masculinity isn't always the same thing. So, hey, if it's in the Y chromosome is pretty leaky.
So I think this big piece that I hear you talking about, Ron, is just the shift in the field and shift in thinking around gender. But of course, we're talking about men, but just the impact of social norms, social factors, that shifts over time. Really, the socially constructed impact of masculinity, and that's been this big change that you've
Yeah.
seen over time in your career.
And we have to give credit to the feminist psychologists who did it first, because they were the first ones to say, hey, wait a minute, these Brunner, Kagan, Musson, Conger studies excluded women. We
Mm,
don't necessarily have the same developmental trajectories. And
right.
so you have, Carol Gilligan coming up with her own view of women's moral development, that she was a student of Lawrence Kohlberg, who, as you probably know, developed a theory of moral development,
Hmm.
much like Piaget's theory of cognitive development. Well, others were saying, we've got to look at psychotherapy. I mean, think
Yeah.
about psychotherapy. How
Yeah.
was psychotherapy developed? It was men treating women.
Right.
It was Freud and Breuer treating Anna O.
Right.
And so now you've got women treating men, women treating women, and then you enter trans people into the mix. I mean, it gets very complicated very quickly. So the study of gender changed a lot, and we were right on the cusp of that in forming Division 51.
Yeah. So I'm curious, as somebody who's really at the forefront of this kind of modern field of psychology of men and masculinities, even that, right? You've seen that change from masculinity to masculinities, right? That's a shift you've seen. What are some things that you're thinking we still have to understand or address or investigate in this field that's grown so much, but has growth still to do? I'm wondering, since you kind of have this 40,000 foot view, right? What are some things you think we still need to figure out?
Well, the thing it's hard for me to say everything that we need to figure out, and the field has grown, and you know
Yeah.
when at one time there were a handful of scholars and clinicians. By the way, I think of myself as a scientist practitioner,
Yeah.
just sort of the Boulder model that used to govern the way psychologists were trained.
Yeah.
That's changed a lot, but I was trained in that model, and so I think of myself that way. Um, uh, uh, I just want to mention one other thing that I think our field did, and then I'll get to
Yeah. That sounds great, Ron. Go for it.
which is scale development. We
Okay.
have really excelled in scale development. We not only do exploratory, but confirmatory factor analyses. We develop bifactor models. We use structural equation modeling, item response theory. Our scale development articles get published in the top tier journal, the Journal of Counseling Psychology.
Yeah.
Um, and we really have moved the needle on that. But so I think that's another thing to look at. But where the field, I think, has to go is we have to address violence.
Hmm.
Uh, well over 90% of all the gun violence in this country, I'm just focusing on one type of
Yeah.
violence, are committed by boys and men. Well over 90%. Think about that.
Yeah. I mean, that's all that's shocking and concerning, right?
Yeah, and for those of us who study the psychology of men, it ought to be a priority.
Yeah. Right.
The other thing to take into account is probably the vast majority of boys and men, I don't know any statistics on this, but I'd guess well over 90% would never pick up a gun and
Right.
shoot people.
Right.
So you got, this incongruence. And I wrote an article that was published in the Psychology of Men and Masculinities in 2020, trying to account for this.
Okay.
And what I did is the gender role strain paradigm, which is the one that Pleck
Yeah.
had introduced and we've all been kind of working with. Even gender role conflict theory is kind of related to that. The gender role strain paradigm, I lost my train of thought. Where was I? Oh, yeah. Basically posits that when we socialize children to conform to gender norms, social norms, we put a strain on their personalities. And you think about it, I mean, if you have if you take any personality trait and you measure, let's say aggression, you measure
Hmm.
1,000 boys, you'll get a bell curve
Sure.
distribution of scores, right?
Yeah.
I'm talking like the Bus-Perry aggression scale.
Yeah.
Um, um, if your boy happens to be on the low end and you want him to be aggressive, think of the harm you're doing to that boy's personality.
Yeah.
So
Right.
this is gender role strain.
Yeah.
Um, and um, uh, and we found, or in my article, I theorized and found evidence for the fact that the males who are more prone to be aggressive, and that's where I started, because you really can't study violence in the laboratory. So I started off with indicators of violence. So it'd be self-reports of past violence. It would be things like hostility towards women or minoritized racial, ethnic, or
Yeah.
sexual orientation groups, and so on. Or it would be in an experiment of either punching a punching bag
Yeah.
or administering a bogus
Right.
shot to
Yeah.
a Confederate. So that's as close as we can get to studying violence. So what I did find and I went out of my comfort zone. I didn't just look in psychology. I looked in sociology, cultural anthropology, criminology, and social work. I found exactly the same finding
Mm.
using different terms and obviously different methods to
Right.
study it. Most of those fields use qualitative methods. Psychology tends to use quantitative methods, although some qualitative. The same finding: men whose masculinity was threatened, who fell who were made to feel that they didn't live up to their internalized ideals were more likely to, be strong on these indicators of violence.
Yeah.
Then I found three sources of actual shooters. One is a school shooter database, and two were qualitative studies, one of mass shooters and one of murder suicides. And these categories overlap because Columbine, for example, was all three.
Yeah.
Um, the school shooter database is searchable. It wasn't at the time I wrote my book, but it was at the time I wrote the article. And I searched for manhood, masculinity, masculinities. And then I looked at the case. So what's in this database are all the records of any of every school shooter, school records, court records, health records, the shooter's own writings. I read, I think it was 18 cases. All
Okay.
of the males were like they were all had experienced that they weren't as masculine as they wanted to be. The classic example is Adam Lanza, who is 6'2" and weighed 80 pounds.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
And he, wanted to go in the military and, and he used an AR-15 to mow down those poor children.
Yeah.
So we have this information. We have some. So the next question is, if we know that males, boys and men whose masculinity is threatened or they feel they don't measure up are prone to violence, what can we do about
What
it?
do we do? Yep.
So I'm just writing up a study that I completed with my colleague Ryan McDermott and a
Yeah.
group of students, where we're looking at seeing. We looked at three variables that we thought might moderate the link between discrepancy strain on the one hand and indicators of violence. They were empathy and compassion.
Okay.
For the first two. I thought, okay, if someone, like, let's take the Buffalo shooter. If that person had a lot of empathy and compassion, maybe he might have found another way to deal with his negative attitudes towards blacks than killing them.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that was the first hypothesis. And the second one was, what does discrepancy strain do? Well, it creates a sense of shame. And shame, as we know, is a very toxic emotion. So I thought, well, maybe if you had self-compassion, the shame wouldn't be so intense and the man wouldn't feel the need. So it turns out self-compassion works as a moderator, and it actually changes the valence of the relationship. You start off with a linear positive relationship between discrepancy strain and indicators of violence. And when you add self-compassion as a moderator, you have a linear
Flips.
negative relationship.
Okay.
Pretty profound.
That is, yeah, profound. And in particular, what I think I heard you say is that self-compassion piece. Instead of maybe not, well, I think just compassion generally and empathy for other people, right, that is important, but it seems like that piece in particular sifted out or stood out.
That piece seemed to be what might, if we could find a way to increase the self-compassion,
Yeah.
men who feel their masculinity is threatened,
Yeah.
we might be able to impact gun violence. I mean, I'm not saying that that's apart from, gun safety legislation or other measures, community programs to engage youth so that they don't go in this direction. All those things are important.
Yeah.
But I'm approaching this as a psychologist. What can
Right.
we uniquely contribute? And there it is.
Yeah, that's fascinating as I think of some of the work that's recently come out around healthy masculinities and what healthy masculinities can look like. And I know that a fair amount of discussion in there has been compassion and compassion as a kind of a mitigator to violence. And so that's really interesting to hear you talk about the empirical support for that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, Well, I think kind of finally here, just to wrap up, I know you've talked about this some. You talked about, I think, this a fair amount at the very beginning, Ron. But I think one last thing I think that would be great to hear any kind of notes or final comments on from you is, the personal piece. Like, as this person who's been immersed in this field of men and masculinities, as a man yourself, like how this has impacted you, how this has changed you as a person. I think that piece is important, and wondering if you have any final comments about that.
Well, this is going to be the mic dropping comment.
Okay,
I've
I'll be
re
ready. I'll hold it and then I'll drop it when you say it.
I've recently written my memoir.
Yeah.
Is in production. It'll be out this summer. It's called The Problem with Men.
Hmm.
And why I've so titled it is because I'm a trauma survivor, and I was suffered verbal and physical abuse from my father from about the age of 2, and uh, bullying by anti-Semitic bullies from about the age of 5.
Hmm.
And uh, you know, as my life developed and evolved, and I, became a psychologist, I became, an underlying motive was really understand why so many men were so despicable,
Yeah. Yeah.
and what made them behave in such heinous ways. And so there's always been kind of it wasn't until I wrote the memoir that really crystallized for me.
Sure.
Um, and but and I wrote the memoir, to try to inspire and encourage other people who might be in a similar situation. Because if you look at my life, up until the time I graduated from high school, you would have never guessed
Hmm.
that I'd be the man talking to you today.
Okay.
Because I went from abused boy to juvenile delinquent,
Hmm.
and I was arrested, and I was for drunkenness and vandalism. I was expelled from high school.
Wow.
Uh, right?
Yeah, right. That's the part of the mic drop. Yeah, I
Yeah.
appreciate you sharing that. So yeah, continue. Yeah.
But yeah, so I had a lucky break. Um, I was sitting around with some brochures thinking after I graduated high school. I got kicked out of one high school, finished at another one. My mother won, after I got kicked out of high school, my mother won a marriage-long argument with my father, which is that we should live in a Jewish neighborhood. Where I grew up, there wasn't even a synagogue.
Hmm.
And as I mentioned, uh, it was a very anti-Semitic
Yeah.
neighborhood. So we moved from Southgate, California, which is in Los Angeles County, to what's called the Borscht Belt,
Okay.
the Jewish neighborhood in West Hollywood.
Okay.
Um, and I had in Southgate, none of my friends' parents had gone to college. None of my friends had planned to go to college. Their highest aspiration, a lot of them just wanted to go in the military. Their highest aspiration was to learn a trade. Most of their dads worked in factories. There were 2 major factories,
Yeah.
Firestone and General Motors, and they worked on the factory line. So it was a real working class, blue collar neighborhood. My dad had only an 8th grade education.
Hmm.
He learned a trade in the Navy during World War II. He was a Seabee, and he learned printing, so he became a pressman. Then he eventually bought his own print shop. So he became a small businessman about the time I entered college. But in any event, I wasn't thinking of college. I hadn't met any kids whose parents had gone to college until I went to Fairfax. And so I was immersed. Had a girlfriend who was wanted to go to Berkeley.
Yeah.
Berkeley at the time was like far and away the best university in the world.
Yeah.
Yeah. And uh, um, uh, and so I was open to the idea,
Yeah.
and I was still thinking of joining the Marines. And a friend came by and said, "I'm going to LA City College to take the admissions test. I'm a little nervous about it. Would you come and hang out with me?" So I said, "Sure." So I took the test. What am I going to do? Sit there for an hour while he takes it? So I took the test. I got in, and I met some in faculty. These faculty don't have PhDs. They mostly have master's degrees, as you probably know.
Yeah.
But they were really good.
Yeah.
They're really good at working with first generation college students, and I discovered that I was really pretty good in math. I
Yeah.
had no idea. And I mean, at Southgate, I never took my books out of the locker. I never took them home.
Okay.
It was just not my thing. And so I took trigonometry and then Calc 1 and Calc 2. And I got into, after 3 semesters at Berkeley, at City, I got into Berkeley, which is the
Yeah.
biggest jump you can imagine from
Yeah. Right.
a community college to the flagship, because you have another tier of the
Yeah.
California State
Right.
Universities, which would be logical. But and then you have other universities that aren't quite like you have Davis or Irvine. Berkeley is up there. So I
Yeah.
got into Berkeley. And as they say, the rest is history.
Yeah. I appreciate you're willing to share that. Just as I hear people tell their stories, as colleagues tell their stories, I'm just surprised by the even small things like that of you just saying, well, my friend asked me to come and take this admissions test, and that opened this door for you. Moving to this neighborhood opened a door for you. Um, and so I think that's great for folks to hear that. These small windows for somebody who's, changed the course of the field. And so I think that that can be the case for a lot of folks, right? That these small windows can really help them as well. And that doesn't diminish the work and the effort, of course, and the initiative, et cetera. But I just really thankful for you telling that story. I appreciate it, Ron.
Yeah, I just hope people, if the people are listening who are kind of struggling in life,
Yeah,
to realize that, there might be a small window you could open for yourself.
yeah, yeah,
And that if somebody like me, who had a pretty ragged childhood,
yeah,
could
yeah,
become somebody like the person I am now,
yeah,
why can't you?
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that can be you too.
Yeah.
Well, that's great. Well, I think that's a great point to finish our conversation, a really hopeful place to finish our conversation. And just thanks for your willingness to share that with me and share that with other folks too.
Well, I'm sharing it with the world because the memoir is coming out.
Yeah, right. That's exciting to hear about that. So I'm really looking forward to that as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it was a pleasure talking to you, and good luck with your project. It's really a worthwhile thing to do, and I wish you all the success in it.
Yeah, I really appreciate it as well. It was great to talk with you. It was great to learn from you. And again, just an exciting moment for me, just as somebody who knows so much about your work. And so, yeah, just really thank you for that. So, yeah, have a good day, and then I'll be in touch with you. Yeah, hopefully not too much longer.
All right, take
Okay,
care.
bye, Ron.